What if I told you, behind the elegance of kimonos, the strict codes of the samurai, and the polished art of tea ceremonies, there were secrets so shocking they could rewrite everything you thought you knew about Japan's past? In the shadows of feudal castles and hidden quarters, people practiced traditions that today would leave us speechless, rituals of intimacy tied to power, survival, and sometimes even danger. This isn't the Japan you saw in films. It's stranger, darker, and far more fascinating. Before we dive into these untold stories, comment below what time you're watching this. I love seeing when history lovers around the world tune in. And if you enjoy uncovering the side of history schools never dared to mention, you're welcome to subscribe. No pressure, but trust me, the stories only get wilder from here. You start in the hushed corridors of a daimyo's residence, where sliding doors seem to swallow every whisper, and paper walls hold back more secrets than they let through. The tatami smells faintly of rice straw and old incense, a smell that says, "This house has seen things." Servants glide by their eyes, lowered their feet, padded because in this world, silence is an unspoken currency. The upper rooms are reserved for guests and formalities, where every boo is measured, every word rehearsed. But below that polished layer, there are rooms you never see on a tour, rooms whose entrances hide behind folding screens or cupboards, rooms where a person might disappear without leaving the house. These are the chambers that separate the public mask from the private self, and navigating them is like learning a second language, except no one will ever admit it exists. In a feudal society where etiquette can decide your fate, the ability to read these invisible boundaries is as important as knowing how to hold a teacup. The public-facing spaces are designed like stages. You kneel at exactly the right distance from a superior. You pour sake for a guest with both hands. You avoid topics that would chip the porcelain of formality. The walls are thin, but the rules are thick, and everyone plays along, because to stumble here isn't just embarrassing. It can mark you for life. Think of it like a company boardroom today. The deals aren't necessarily decided at the table, but your reputation certainly is. It's tempting to imagine that what happened behind those hidden doors was wild and unchecked. But in reality, even private spaces followed their own codes. The daimyo's wife might have her own quarters, rarely visited except on certain occasions, while the husband might keep separate sleeping arrangements. This separation wasn't necessarily about romance. It was about rank politics and the preservation of face. And yet those back rooms were where whispered agreements were made, where alliances could form without the oversight of the wider household. You wonder if this quiet double life wasn't exhausting, keeping your outward self so separate from your inner reality. Guests who were invited into more intimate spaces often received a subtle message you were trusted, or at least useful enough to be shown the unpolished side of the house. Sometimes these hidden rooms weren't physically hidden at all, but socially invisible. No one spoke of them, and their purpose was simply accepted. The average retainer or servant could tell you which rooms were for show and which were for living, but they wouldn't dream of pointing it out to you directly. There's a peculiar safety in pretending not to notice. Occasionally, these private quarters were designed with physical tricks, staircases tucked into closets, corridors that led to nowhere unless you knew which panel to slide. Some houses had night corridors for movement after dark, allowing certain individuals to reach certain rooms without crossing the more public spaces. These weren't exactly architectural secrets like hidden treasure vaults. They were simply the practical expression of a social reality privacy in a culture that prized appearances. If you've ever worked in an open-plan office but had a back kitchen where people whispered their real thoughts, you'll understand the logic here. Life in a samurai household was both a performance and a negotiation, and the layout of the home reflected that duality. Every room told you where you stood. Every path showed you how much you were trusted or how much you were being kept out. Sometimes you wonder what it would be like to walk these halls without knowing the rules. Would you stumble into the wrong sliding door and find yourself face to face with someone you shouldn't, in a world where a misplaced step could cost you more than just embarrassment? The art of moving quietly and reading the air wasn't just etiquette, it was survival. You quickly learn that the architecture of relationships in feudal Japan is just as deliberate as the architecture of the houses themselves. Marriage here isn't always about the sweep you off your feet love story. It's a careful construction of alliances, influence, and the secure passing down of land and titles. The wedding might be celebrated with poetry, lacquered trays of sake, and ornate kimono. But somewhere beneath the layers of silk lies a contract written in more than just ink. It's written in clan politics, in obligations owed, and in the delicate arithmetic of who benefits most from the union. For high-ranking samurai or daimyo, marriage could be a chess move. A bride from a powerful family brought prestige and connections. A groom from a respected line could open doors to military or court positions. And while the couple might share moments of genuine affection, the foundation of the match rested firmly on political utility. You see it even today in certain corporate or political circles. The merger of two families can look suspiciously like a merger between two companies. In both cases, the fine print matters as much as the vows. Concubines played their own role in this system, existing alongside the principal wife. They weren't merely indulgences, they could be essential in producing heirs if the primary marriage didn't. For a man of status, a concubine might be chosen with as much care as a bride, her family background and personal talents carefully weighed. These relationships were acknowledged within the household hierarchy, though not always publicly celebrated. Imagine running a household where every relationship has its own political gravity. You'd need the balancing skills of a diplomat. Divorce, while less common among the elite, wasn't impossible. In some cases, a man could end a marriage with a simple written notice called a mikudari han, essentially a 3.5 lines letter of dismissal. This sounds cold to modern ears, but it was part of a legal framework that allowed both parties to remarry if needed. For women, however, divorce was far more constrained, often dependent on the man's consent or on the intervention of her natal family. The stakes weren't just emotional, they were economic and social, determining whether a woman returned to her family with honor or disgrace. In certain situations, secondary partnerships were quietly acknowledged without official status. A merchant, for instance, might keep a long-term companion even if he was formally married, and while the arrangement might raise eyebrows, it could also be understood as part of the complex fabric of domestic life. These quiet contracts didn't always involve written agreements. They were sustained by mutual benefit trust, or simply the ability to keep the arrangement discreet. Walking through this world, you notice that the people who thrive aren't always the most powerful, they're the most adaptable. The wife who skillfully maintains her position, alongside a politically useful concubine. The concubine who avoids overstepping and thus secures her own stability. The husband, who can balance these relationships without allowing them to fracture his household. There's an art to it, and it's as intricate as a folded origami crane. Even the language around these relationships reflects the balancing act. Publicly, you might hear respectful titles and carefully chosen compliments. Privately, conversations could carry an undercurrent of competition, especially when it came to producing heirs or maintaining influence in the household. You can almost imagine the silent calculations at a formal dinner: who sits where, who pours for whom, who dares to hold eye contact just a little longer than necessary. It's not that love was absent. In many cases, couples did find genuine companionship and affection within these frameworks. But in feudal Japan, the romantic ideal was often tempered by the realities of inheritance law, clan politics, and the ever-present need to avoid scandal. Relationships were both personal and public property, and managing them well was part of maintaining one's honor. The moment you pass through the great wooden gates of Yoshiwara, it feels like stepping into an entirely different country, one with its own clocks, currency, and constitution. This isn't the dusty, sun-bleached town outside the walls. This is the pleasure quarter, a district designed from the ground up to be both irresistible and highly controlled. The air smells faintly of grilled skewers and sweet sake lantern light, turning the street into a river of gold. You hear shamisen music spilling from tea houses, laughter from behind sliding screens, and the occasional bark of a toot trying to draw you toward a particular establishment. The real shock is how orderly it all is. You might expect chaos in a place devoted to fantasy, but here, every interaction is scripted. Courtesans don't just meet you on a whim. There are appointments, fees, formal introductions, and in some cases, a whole sequence of visits before anything personal happens. In a strange way, it feels like an exclusive members-only club crossed with a theatrical performance. You don't simply buy time, you buy a role in someone else's drama. The courtesans themselves are more like celebrities than what your modern mind might imagine. The highest-ranking oiran wear towering hair ornaments and layered silk so heavy it could double as light armor. Walking in those elaborate costumes is a performance in itself, slow and deliberate, with an almost hypnotic sway. You might compare it to watching a modern runway show. Every step is meant to be noticed, every detail engineered to signal status. The lower-ranking women still dress beautifully, but they work within stricter constraints, their interactions quicker and less ceremonial. Even the food and drink in Yoshiwara are part of the act. You might be offered seasonal delicacies arranged as if for a still life painting, or sack poured from a porcelain decanter, so fine you're afraid to touch it. Time here is measured not by the sun, but by the hourglass of your appointment. And when your time is up, there is no negotiation. You leave through the same gate you entered, taking your memory of the evening with you. The gates themselves close at nightfall, a physical reminder that this world is as much a cage as it is a stage. You realize that Yoshiwara is as much about control as it is about indulgence. The shogunate regulated it heavily, not just to keep order, but to channel certain activities into predictable, taxable, and visible forms. Outside the walls, these interactions could threaten reputations or destabilize households. Inside, they are part of a monitored economy. If you've ever been to a theme park, you know the feeling. Yes, you're here for fun, but you're also following a path someone else has designed. Complete with rules, You may not even notice until you break them. One curious thing, many of the people who came here weren't just looking for romance or entertainment. They came for status, to be seen in the company of certain courtesans, to prove they could afford it. A night in Yoshiwara could function like a business card, costly brief, and designed to be remembered. And just like a business card, it said more about the person handing it over than the person receiving it. The streets outside the quarter might gossip about who had been seen with whom, but inside discretion was part of the sale. Of course, discretion here didn't mean secrecy. It meant that the right people heard the right stories. That careful curation of reputation was as valuable as any other service provided within the walls. You can't help but wonder if the real product Yoshiwara sold wasn't companionship at all. It was the illusion of being someone more important, more glamorous, more connected than you were outside the gates. And in that way, it's not so different from the exclusive parties or VIP clubs of today. Outside the gates of Yoshiwara, another world of performance thrives, one where intimacy is replaced by art and the rules are even more exacting. You find yourself in a geisha district, its narrow lanes lit by paper lanterns swaying in the breeze, the faint pluck of a shamisen guiding you toward a low tea house. A geisha's work is not to promise romance, but to deliver an evening so polished, so elegantly constructed that you forget time exists. Here, everything is artifice, but in the best possible sense, the kind of artifice that takes years of discipline to perfect. Apprentice geisha called Maiko in Kyoto begin their training almost as children. Their first months are spent learning how to walk without their knees bobbing, how to kneel without their toes twitching, how to serve tea without spilling a single drop. It's the kind of precision that would make a modern stage actor nervous. Every gesture has meaning. Every glance is part of the performance. Over time, they learn the shamisen traditional dance-witty conversation and the subtle art of reading a guest's mood without ever being told. If you've ever watched a seasoned host at a dinner party know exactly when to refill your glass or change the subject, you've seen the same skill in miniature. Unlike the pleasure quarters, geisha houses operated under strict boundaries. Physical relationships with clients were not part of the professional role, though legends and gossip sometimes suggested otherwise. The point was to provide refined company, not personal attachment. A wealthy patron might sponsor a geisha's career, paying for her training kimono and living expenses, but even this relationship was bound by rules, ceremonies, and the careful choreography of public appearances. The danger for a geisha wasn't scandal from being too aloof. It was scandal from being too familiar. Every element of a geisha's appearance spoke a language. The angle of her hair ornaments could indicate her stage of apprenticeship. The patterns on her kimono might nod to the season, a literary reference, or a particular festival. Even the color of her collar could signal her experience level. It's not unlike how today's professionals might signal seniority through subtle details, a bespoke suit, a certain watch, the kind of pen you carry. You might not consciously notice these cues, but in the right circles, they are read instantly. Some of the most famous geisha in history, like Mineko Iwasaki, though, from a much later period, demonstrated that a successful career was as much about strategic self-presentation as it was about skill. While her era differed from the strictest days of the Edo period, the principle was the same. A geisha's value was built on reputation, and reputation was guarded like treasure. One whispered rumor could undermine years of training, which is why these women mastered not only the arts, but also the delicate politics of conversation and association. You notice that an evening with a geisha doesn't feel transactional in the same way as a night in the pleasure quarter. There's no clock running down on a contracted appointment. Instead, there's the sense of being folded into an ongoing story, one in which your role is flattering but temporary. The goal is for you to leave thinking you've been part of something rare and cultured, even if the same dance will be performed tomorrow for someone else. Behind the grace, however, is a grueling schedule. Mornings begin with practice, afternoons with fittings or lessons, evenings with engagements that can stretch past midnight. A geisha's days are as structured as those of a soldier. Only the battlefield here is a tatami room, and the weapons are charm conversation and a perfectly timed laugh. If you think small talk is easy, you've never seen it elevated to a competitive sport. By the time you step back into the cool night air, the performance is over, but the spell lingers. You carry with you the strange sensation that you've glimpsed a hidden world, not because it was secret, in the scandalous sense, but because it operates on rules entirely separate from the ones outside its lantern-lit streets. The smallest book in the room is the one that makes you blush and laugh hard enough for the censors to sharpen their knives. You ease open a palm-sized album and meet the quick wit of Edo printmakers, a humor so mischievous it hides in plain sight. You read them the way you read comics, panel to panel, with sight gags tucked into margins, speech left unsaid, and props doing half the talking. The artists exaggerate fans, robes, hairpins, folding screens, anything that can become a punchline. You notice how laughter does most of the heavy lifting, turning delicate topics into parables about vanity bragging and the eternal human talent for getting tangled in one's own plans. Names float up from the paper, like signatures you already know. Hokusai, sketching with a restless wrist. Utamaro, chasing expressions as if they're butterflies. Harunobu, folding seasons into fabrics, so the joke also smells like plum blossoms. They're not writing instruction manuals. They're staging little theater plays where timing is inked, not spoken. Censors, of course, never enjoy being the butt of a joke. Under the Kansei reforms in the late 1700s and the Tenpo reforms in the 1840s, officials patrol the bookshops and ban what looks like luxury nightlife or satire. They stamp, they snip woodblocks, and printers learn to keep two ledgers, one for the shop window, one for the back room. You tilt a page against the light and spot a clever fix, an extra swirl of pattern. Where something once stood, a conveniently placed sleeve, a fan that drifts like a cloud to cover what the rules insist should not be weather. Think of it as the Edo version of pixelation, only prettier. Have you ever laughed in a museum and pretended it was a cough? Because prints travel well, merchants tuck them into sleeves, and samurai claim to read them for the art. A bride's trousseau might quietly include a slim bundle, a gift from an aunt with a raised eyebrow and excellent timing. The point isn't shock. It's fluency, knowing the unspoken joke so you don't trip over it later at the dinner table. What keeps surprising you is how often the humor aims upward at hypocrisy rather than downward at people with less power. A swaggering dandy misreads every cue and ends up bowing to the wrong person. A miser counts coins so obsessively he forgets his tea is boiling over. How do you shame vanity without scolding? You make the mirror laugh back. Utamaro's women glance over shoulders with expressions that are half secret, half sport, reminding you of Section 4's tea house wit, where a perfectly timed pause says more than a paragraph. The prince quote poetry riff on famous plays, and hide puns in seasonal flowers. When crackdowns intensify, shops adopt cat and mouse tactics. Printers carve detachable blocks so a risky detail can be swapped for a more innocent motif when the patrols are near. Booksellers learn to run out of the controversial edition 5 minutes after the officer leaves. If you've ever watched content moderators sprint after a meme, you know the choreography. The funny thing about banning laughter is that it teaches audiences to read more attentively. Viewers learn to decode sleeve lengths. Umbrella angles the tilt of a lantern visual grammar that carries jokes in plain sight. It's a literacy you feel in your fingertips as you trace the paper's edge, noticing how a chrysanthemum can be a calendar note and how a stray cat in a corner is rarely stray. Occasionally, officials stage public confiscations to prove a point. Prints are seized, blocks destroyed, fines levied, and then the tide recedes because the city needs its small rebellions to breathe. What do you think a censor fears more, a riot or a giggle that won't stop artists respond with more allegory? A carp leaps a waterfall and becomes a dragon, the old tale repurposed as a wink about ambition and transformation. A folding screen opens the wrong way and reveals that appearances always have hinges. The joke becomes a set of nested boxes, each lid painted with a proverb. In the bookshops along Nihonbashi, buyers flip pages the way you sample tea, quick sips, then a longer sip when the flavor lingers. Clerks wrap albums in plain paper and advise discretion with a nod that means everything. Friends stage parlor games to spot references hidden in kimono patterns or stage props. Have you ever caught an inside joke in a show and felt oddly seen? The same grin blooms here. You pause over a page where the artisan's knife has nicked the wood, leaving a tiny scar that prints as a flick of lightning across a sleeve. It's a mistake that reads like emphasis, a reminder that handmade mischief leaves fingerprints. By the time you close the album, you've learned a quiet rule Edo artists repeat. If people can laugh together, they can remember together. The censors may police displays, but they struggle with memory when it is attached to a smile. You tuck the book back into its sleeve, the paper whispering like water against a boat. You wander from the bookshops, back toward the barracks, and suddenly the polished prints of Edo give way to the steel and silence of samurai life. The warriors are supposed to be the embodiment of a stoicism, their swords as sharp as their discipline. Yet when you listen closely, you hear another story murmuring beneath the armor. Bonds between older and younger samurai, sometimes referred to as wakashudo, the way of the youth, were as structured as any martial drill. These weren't whispered affairs in a scandalous sense, but framed in the language of loyalty, mentorship, and shared oaths. An older samurai might take on a younger companion, offering not just training in swordsmanship, but also guidance in etiquette, poetry, and the broader ideals of Bushido. In return, the younger one pledged devotion, service, and a kind of fidelity that blurred the line between personal affection and military discipline. If this sounds complicated, it is because in the context of the time, it wasn't viewed as a contradiction. To be bound to someone by both sword and heart meant that the loyalty ran deeper than blood. You might compare it to the tight-knit bonds formed in modern military units, where soldiers speak of brothers in arms and often place one another above all else. Literature of the period doesn't exactly whisper about this dynamic. It speaks openly, though coated in elegant metaphors. Tales like Nanshoku Okagami, The Great Mirror of Male Love, written by Ihara Saikaku in 1687, compiled dozens of stories that treat these relationships as natural features of samurai life. Some are tragic, some comic, but all take for granted that such bonds existed and carried social meaning. When you leaf through these stories, you notice how honor and romance are braided together, each reinforcing the other. To betray your partner wasn't just a personal failing, it was a crack in the code of loyalty that defined you as a warrior. In practice, these relationships were often temporary, meant to last until the younger partner matured into full samurai status. At that point, the dynamic might shift into lasting friendship or dissolve with mutual respect. There was nothing hidden about it in the way later societies might try to suppress such bonds. Instead, it was circumscribed by rules: never exploit the youth, never let the affection weaken your martial duty, and always remember that loyalty to lord and clan outweighed everything else. A code within a code, really. If you think about the Chushingura, the famous tale of the 47 Ronin, you catch glimpses of the same ethos. The loyalty those men displayed toward their fallen lord has echoes of the personal loyalties described in Wakashudo. The idea was simple: a warrior's life gained meaning when bound to another's cause, another's honor. Is it any wonder, then, that affection and devotion overlapped so naturally? You wonder how ordinary townsfolk viewed such bonds. To them, samurai already seemed like a breed, a part bound by rituals of death and loyalty that were difficult to understand. The affectionate oaths of warriors may have seemed like just another layer of strangeness in a class whose lives were half theater, half battlefield. And perhaps like the coded laughter of Shunga prince, these bonds were accepted because everyone knew the samurai lived by different rules. Even today, when historians trace these patterns, it's easy to impose modern categories that don't quite fit. What mattered in the Edo context was less about defining relationships by names and more about upholding ideals of loyalty, bravery, and mentorship. These were not scandalous secrets, but structured aspects of samurai culture, as integral as learning how to tie armor or recite poetry at a banquet. The older you imagine yourself in this barracks life, the more you realize the sharp line between private and public we saw back in Section 1 exists here too. Oaths, spoken at night by lantern light, might never be repeated on the parade ground at dawn, but both shaped the warrior's sense of self. The sword polished in silence, the poem exchanged with hidden meaning, the unspoken promise of protection, each carried weight, and none could be dismissed as frivolous. The curtain rises again, and this time the stage is bathed in lamplight. You find yourself in a kabuki theater where men play every role, including women, and the performance of beauty itself is rewritten before your eyes. If Section 6 whispered of loyalty and hidden bonds, Section 7 shouts of androgyny and spectacle a world where sleeves make up and stance carry as much weight as swords and scrolls. The Onagata male actors, who specialized in female roles, became cultural icons in their own right. Dressed in layered kimono, their hair sculpted into styles copied from real women, they moved with exaggerated delicacy. A glance down at just the right angle, a pause before lowering a fan, a carefully measured step that suggested both fragility and poise. You realize this isn't pretending in the clumsy sense. It's artistry. They distilled femininity into something heightened, stylized, and then returned it to the audience as a kind of living painting. Audiences adored them, not only for the performances, but for the aesthetic ideal they represented. Women sometimes copied the fashions of Onagata, which tells you everything you need to know about how blurred the line between stage and street could be. Imagine watching a theater star today, whose hairstyle or makeup launches a trend overnight. The Edo equivalent of that influencer culture was alive and well centuries ago. Beauty was not fixed to one gender. It was something performed, practiced, and shared. The government predictably grew anxious. In the early years, kabuki had begun with female performers, but officials worried about the disruption such performances caused, so they banned women from the stage. Young boys replaced them, then adult men, and each new regulation only created new forms of fascination. Instead of ending the allure, the ban sharpened it, turning performance into an experiment in aesthetics and gender itself. Have you noticed how often laws meant to suppress desire end up making it more creative? The makeup of kabuki actors amplified this androgyny. The bold lines of kumadori makeup for heroic roles contrasted with the softer faces of onagata, but both relied on artifice layers upon layers of powder and pigment. The lesson seems clear: beauty here was never about being natural. It was about transformation. To walk into the theater was to agree that people could be remade by costume and gesture, and no one pretended otherwise. Writers of the period leaned into this fluidity. Plays included themes of disguise, mistaken identity, and role reversals, mirroring the real-world play of androgyny on stage. When an onagata wept on cue, it wasn't simply a man acting as a woman. It was a commentary on the performance of gender itself. Long before academics put fancy terms to it, kabuki audiences were already fluent in the language of performance and identity. Some famous actors, like Yoshizawa Ayame, I became legends precisely because they lived their roles off stage as well. Ayame was known for carrying his onagata mannerisms into daily life, embodying femininity so thoroughly that audiences could never tell where the role ended and the man began. Was it performance, or was it self? The fact that no one could quite answer was part of the magnetism. Walking out of the theater, you realize that beauty in Edo Japan wasn't about strict categories, but about the power of suggestion. Hairpins, sleeves the angle of a step, each could tip the balance between masculine and feminine. And if you think about it, the audience didn't come for authenticity. They came for illusion. They knew it was an act, but the act was what made it real. It makes you wonder how much of modern celebrity culture works the same way. When singers or actors reinvent themselves with new looks and personas, are they so different from the kabuki stars who painted their faces white and stepped into roles that blurred every boundary? Steam fogs the air and makes the lanterns glow like floating moons. You step into a bathhouse, the kind that dots every town and village, and instantly realize that cleanliness here isn't just about hygiene. It's about community etiquette and the delicate choreography of bodies sharing the same water. The scent of wet cedar mingles with mineral steam, and every surface seems to hum with the rhythm of routine. Wooden buckets, clatter voices, bounce off tiled walls, and behind the mist strangers coexist in a space that is both public and oddly intimate. The first rule is unspoken but ironclad: you scrub before you soak. Rows of low stools line the washing area, where men and women sit with ladles and rough cloths, dousing themselves in buckets of hot water. Soap as you know it is a later addition. Here, it's friction steam and persistence that cleanse. The bath itself is communal, a large rectangular pool of steaming water into which you only step once you're spotless. If you've ever joined a gym with a shared sauna, you'll recognize the same principle. Don't bring your dirt into someone else's relaxation. In these close quarters, modesty is performed as much as practiced. Towels are small, barely more than handkerchiefs, and people use them to shield or distract without pretending they cover much. Conversation flows easily, though not loudly. The walls are thin, and the bathhouse doubles as a social hub. A merchant might strike up a chat with a farmer, or a craftsman with a traveling monk, all stripped to the same level of humanity. It's one of the few spaces where rank can blur at least temporarily under the steam. Stories swirl about bathhouses, becoming places for gossip, flirtation, and even negotiation. Imagine sitting shoulder to shoulder with a rival, your heads both crowned with steam, trying to outlast one another in the heat while casually discussing the price of rice. The proximity makes honesty more likely. You can't exactly storm out in a huff without dripping all over the floorboards. Have you ever noticed how some of your most candid conversations happen not at desks or dinner tables, but in liminal spaces like car rides or stairwells? The bathhouse was that liminal space for Edo, Japan. Design mattered too. Some bathhouses separated men and women, while others allowed mixed bathing, a practice that startled many foreign visitors when Japan reopened in the 19th century. The idea of mixed baths scandalized Western observers who mistook the relaxed atmosphere for impropriety. In reality, the rules of etiquette were so strict that misbehavior could ruin you socially far more than it could amuse you. Cleanliness was a virtue, and that virtue included clean conduct. Bathhouse culture tied into Japan's broader obsession with purity. Temples had purification rituals, with water households had seasonal bathing customs, and bathhouses extended that practice into everyday life. The act of soaking wasn't only for the skin, it was thought to refresh the spirit ward off illness and restore balance. Farmers came after long days in the fields, merchants after hours at their stalls, and samurai after training in the dojo. Everyone needed the steam. The thin walls and crowded tubs meant curiosity was inevitable. People learned to avert their gaze politely, to focus on conversation or the play of steam against the rafters. If someone seemed overly attentive, they were quietly shunned. Reputation in a neighborhood could rise or fall depending on how you carried yourself in these shared waters. It wasn't the nudity that mattered, it was the respect. Every splash, every ladle of hot water felt like part of a ritual repeated endlessly across towns and seasons. The bathhouse stood as a reminder that even in a rigidly hierarchical society, there were spaces where people could simply be bodies at rest, breathing the same mist, sharing the same silence. And when you finally step back into the cool night air, your skin tingling, and your clothes sticking lightly to your damp shoulders, you realize that this simple act of communal bathing held the power to soften the edges of class suspicion and distance. The mist of the bathhouse fades, and you find yourself walking beneath shrine gates painted a red so vivid it seems to pulse even in moonlight. Here, the conversation shifts from steam to spirits, from the cleansing of the body to the coaxing of the unseen. Fertility, prosperity, harmony. These were not abstractions in feudal Japan, but urgent needs, and shrines became the stage where people bargained with the invisible. You notice the votive tablets hanging like wooden leaves on racks, each one painted with prayers. Some bear neat brush strokes, others hurried scribbles, but most plead for children's safe childbirth or family continuity. The clink of coins tossed into offering boxes keeps time with whispered hopes, a percussion of longing. How different is it really from writing down your goals on sticky notes and pinning them to your fridge door? Both acts say, I want this future to hear me. Talismans omamori dangle from belts or are tucked into sleeves, charms bought from shrine maidens who tie them up with solemn bows. Some protect against illness, others encourage conception, others promise harmony in a household that might otherwise fray under pressure. The power wasn't in the silk pouch itself, but in the belief reinforced each time you touched it. Even the most hardened samurai might quietly carry one because who would risk offending a deity when heirs were at stake? Calendars mattered as much as amulets. Families consulted onmyoji practitioners of yin-yang cosmology to find auspicious days for weddings or attempts to conceive. Certain nights were avoided. Certain alignments were courted with almost mathematical precision. Imagine the nervous planning, marking a scroll with circles and notes, double-checking with a neighbor who'd heard of someone's unlucky timing. When lives and legacies hung on producing the right heir, no precaution was too small. Festivals layered these hopes with spectacle. At fertility shrines, giant carved symbols were paraded through towns to laughter and applause, shocking to later eyes, but perfectly natural in context. The crowd treated it not as scandal, but as blessing, a theatrical reminder that abundance was communal, not just private. Children scampered alongside, shouting, while elders clapped in rhythm, and the village reaffirmed its trust in cycles larger than itself. Superstition bled into everyday gestures. A pregnant woman might avoid looking at fire lest it burn her child's spirit. A father-to-be might chew on symbolic foods, believed to grant strength or cleverness to the unborn. The logic was sometimes charming, sometimes elaborate, but always earnest. If you've ever followed a ritual before an exam, lucky socks a particular breakfast, you already understand the impulse. One striking element is how public the pursuit of fertility could be. In a society that valued heirs above nearly all else, praying for children wasn't a private confession, but a communal act. Your neighbors might know exactly what you'd written on your EMA, and they'd nod in sympathy or encouragement. This wasn't embarrassment. It was survival, because families without heirs risked losing their land, their rank, even their name. Shrines also tied sexuality to the cosmic order, framing desire not as shameful, but as necessary for balance. The gods themselves in myths were often depicted as playful, quarrelsome, and fertile. Worshippers mirrored these stories with rituals that blended reverence and humor, acknowledging that the human drive to connect was part of something bigger. It was a worldview where laughter and prayer could sit side by side at the altar. By the time you pass back under the shrine gate, the smell of incense clinging to your sleeves, you realize that these talismans and omens weren't fringe curiosities. They were daily lifelines. They translated uncertainty into action, longing into ritual chants, into something that felt navigable. And in a world where the future of a family, a clan, or even a village might hinge on one child who wouldn't grasp at every possible blessing, the drumbeat of festivals and shrines gives way to the sharper rhythm of politics. You're pulled into a world where rulers anxiously scan the behavior of their people, where edicts against indulgence pile up like paperwork, and where scandal can shake entire households. If Section 9 showed how people prayed for heirs, Section 10 shows how governments tried to regulate what those same people did in pursuit of them. And the hook here is blunt. In feudal Japan, the greatest scandal was often not what happened in private, but when it spilled into the public eye. Shoguns and their advisors understood that pleasure had power. The Tokugawa regime, determined to keep society orderly, issued sumptuary laws that dictated everything from what fabrics townspeople could wear to where and how they could seek entertainment. The Kansei reforms of the late 18th century and the Tenpo reforms of the 1840s were particularly strict, attempting to choke off what officials saw as moral laxity. No silk for merchants, no extravagant hair, ornaments, no indulgent theater plots. It sounds almost comic until you realize the logic. Keep people modest, and you keep them obedient. But the gap between decree and daily life yawned wide. Merchants secretly commissioned lavish kimono with muted outer layers that revealed luxurious linings only when the wearer moved just so. Theaters rewrote scripts overnight to dodge censors slipping satire into allegory. Bathhouses, those same communal spaces, humming with steam and chatter, carried on with their mingling crowds, regardless of official disapproval. Have you noticed how quickly rules collapse when everyone agrees to quietly ignore them? Scandals erupted whenever private indulgence crossed into public disgrace. A high-ranking official caught spending too freely in the pleasure quarters could end up in exile or stripped of rank. A daimyo who failed to manage his household, allowing rumors of affairs or abuse to leak out, risked losing not only reputation, but leverage at court. These weren't simply moral failings. They were political vulnerabilities, cracks others could pry open. In a culture obsessed with appearances, scandal was a weapon as sharp as any sword. And yet fascination with scandal never waned. Townspeople gossiped in tea stalls about which actor was favored by which patron. Pamphlets circulated with thinly disguised caricatures of powerful men, their supposed indiscretions illustrated with sly humor. The very attempts to suppress pleasure only made stories about it more appealing. It's not unlike modern tabloids. What's banned in one paper finds its way into another, and the scandal becomes bigger precisely because it was censored. Western visitors in the 19th century arriving after Japan reopened were often scandalized by things locals found ordinary, like mixed bathing or fertility festivals. At the same time, Japanese observers looked at Western scandals, affairs in royal courts, duels sparked by jealousy, and shook their heads at the supposed civilized world. The mirror of judgment, it seems, always points both ways. As modernization crept in, especially after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, attitudes shifted. Old practices were rebranded as backward, and Japan hurried to present itself as disciplined and modern to Western eyes. Public displays of sexuality were scrubbed, theaters reformed, and shrines reinterpreted. The irony is sharp. What had once been tightly regulated but tolerated was now condemned in the rush to appear respectable on the global stage. The pendulum swings are dizzying. First, officials try to control pleasure through edicts. Then the people subvert them with creativity. Later modernization rebrands the same practices as embarrassing relics. Through it all, the human impulses, connection, beauty, indulgence, humor never vanish. They simply find new disguises, new stages, new scripts. And so by the time you close this long wandering journey, you see feudal Japan not as a land of uniform repression or unbridled freedom, but as a place where both forces constantly collided. Hidden rooms and public masks, contracts and courtesans, humor and censorship, loyalty and androgyny, baths and shrines, edicts and scandals, each played its part in a society that was always negotiating between what could be shown and what must be concealed. The theater of intimacy, in all its forms, never really ended. It just changed costumes with the times. You step back from the dimly lit corridors and festival streets, carrying with you the strange mixture of reverence, regulation, and ritual that shaped the most shocking sexual practices in feudal Japan. But the picture isn't complete without peering into the daily rhythm of the women who lived inside that system. Beyond the headlines of scandal and the whispers of hidden bonds, there were concubines, figures both powerful and fragile, celebrated and confined, draped in silk, yet bound by duty. Their existence was not just about nightfall rituals or whispered alliances. It was an all-day performance of survival and influence. To follow one concubine from sunrise to candlelight is to glimpse the machinery behind the allure. The first sound that drags you into consciousness is not a rooster crow or a bell. It's the eerie hush of sliding paper walls, thinner than a whisper, filtering dawn's light like a watercolor wash. Hooked yet, you should be, because this is no ordinary wake-up. You're a concubine in feudal Japan, and your day begins long before the lord of the manor even stirs. The air is cool, faintly perfumed with sandalwood from last night's incense, and somewhere a servant tiptoes across polished floorboards, her footfalls barely audible. You don't move right away. You're trained not to. Stillness is its own currency, and in this house, every small gesture carries weight. Attendants arrive with the same precision as clockwork. They kneel at your futon, whispering formal greetings, and set out combs carved from boxwood powders ground from rice, and a tray of delicate hairpins that could double as tiny spears if you were desperate enough. You rise, carefully slipping into a posture drilled into you for years. Straight back, downcast eyes, hands folded as if you'd been born folded. While your hair is being tugged into elaborate shapes, you can't help thinking that even Instagram influencers today don't spend this much effort before breakfast. The clothes come next. Layers of silk, each dyed and patterned to whisper a particular status story, are draped over your shoulders by practiced hands. The color choice is rarely yours. It's decided by rank season and the whims of a lord who might never notice the difference anyway. Yet you know better than to complain. These fabrics are expensive imported dyes woven into the economy of power. You wear them not just on your body, but on your future. Remember Lady Kasuga, the influential concubine who maneuvered her way into being the political guardian of the Tokugawa clan's heir. Her sleeves were more than fashion. They were banners in a war of subtle influence. Once your body has been dressed into the role your face must follow, powder smooths over natural features until you resemble a porcelain mask. A faint stroke of crimson at the lips, a dab of black at the brows, and suddenly you are someone who belongs to this palace. The makeup is both armor and disguise. Have you ever wondered how much of yourself disappears once the performance begins? That's a question that nags at you in the quiet moments, though you'll never admit it aloud. Breakfast is prepared, though. Prepared is really code for ritualized. Rice steamed until each grain stands proud, a sliver of pickled plum, maybe miso soup if the kitchen is generous. The tray is set on low, lacquered legs, and you eat with measured movements, because to clatter chopsticks would be social suicide. Eating here isn't about filling your stomach. It's about rehearsing poise. It's astonishing how a mouthful of rice can feel like an audition. Compare it to a modern-day business lunch where everyone pretends they're interested in the salad, but are really clocking each other's posture tone and confidence. Different century, same politics of the table. The Lord himself doesn't appear at this hour, which is a small mercy. Instead, you dine among other women of the household, some higher ranked, some lower, all orbiting the same sun of power. The air is filled with politeness, yet under that surface hums an electric awareness who sat closer to the window, whose sleeve brushed, whose hand, who dared to smile a fraction too broadly. You notice these things even when you pretend not to, because survival here means reading silence as fluently as words. After the meal, you step into the inner courtyard where morning light strikes white gravel paths and manicured pines bend like calligraphy strokes against the sky. Your sandals crunch softly, reminding you of your body's presence in a space designed to erase individuality. A concubine is meant to be part of the scenery, ornament, fragrance, fleeting beauty, never the center of the room. Yet you remember stories of concubines who outlasted their rivals precisely because they understood the power of appearing ornamental while plotting in shadows. It's like office politics today. Sometimes the quietest intern knows more than the loudest manager. Servants trail discreetly behind you, carrying fans, towels, and an emergency kit of politeness. You pause near the pond, where koi ripple the water into golden circles. The fish are fat, pampered, shimmering, almost mocking. They have no idea that their entire existence depends on being decorative enough to justify their feedings. For a moment, you can't help but feel kinship with them. The temple bell in the distance signals the official break of day, and you return indoors. The first chapter of your routine is nearly complete. You've been dressed, powdered, fed, and displayed a doll animated into motion. There's still an entire day to endure, a performance that stretches from sun to moon. And though you'd like to imagine otherwise, this is not a role you can step out of. Your attendants bow again, gathering the lacquered trays, sweeping away even the crumbs of breakfast. The smell of incense still lingers in your hair, and your sleeves trail like the tails of quiet birds as you glide back toward the inner chambers. The day is only beginning, and already you sense the weight of watching eyes. The perfumed bath is less about cleanliness and more about theater, and you step into it as though your body were just another stage prop waiting to be arranged. Steam rises from cedarwood tubs, carrying the scent of camellia oil, and attendants pour buckets of warm water over your shoulders. With a choreography that has been repeated so often, it feels almost sacred. You've probably showered before a workday, with half your brain still asleep, right? This is nothing like that. Here, every droplet is counted, every gesture controlled, and the very act of bathing is another reminder that your body does not belong to you alone. They rub fragrant powders along your arms, massaging skin into silk. You're meant to smell like a garden in bloom, even though the nearest garden is 2 courtyards away. As the water laps gently around you, you think of the stories whispered about famous concubines of the past, like Yodo Dono, the concubine who became the mother of Toyotomi Hideyori and wielded influence over samurai clans. Even she, powerful as she became, probably started mornings like this, scrubbed, perfumed, rehearsed into a ritual of beauty that blurred devotion with discipline. When the bathing ends, you're wrapped in fresh layers of linen warm against your skin and guided toward the household altar. A small shrine gleams with offerings, candles, rice, maybe a persimmon carefully sliced. You bow low the tatami mat, brushing your forehead, and offer a prayer to the household gods. Is it faith or performance? Perhaps both. After all, Even belief in the divine can be measured against the expectation of the Lord's household. If your hands tremble or your voice falters, someone will notice. Breakfast follows, though follows isn't the right word. It's more like a continuation of the same ceremony. You sit cross-legged before a low tray of rice miso and pickled vegetables, the steam rising in slow ribbons as if reminding you not to rush. Here, chopsticks are not utensils, they're instruments. You hold them correctly, lift food with elegance, and lower it into your mouth without clinking. Have you ever eaten in such silence that even chewing feels like a crime? That's your morning meal. And yes, someone is always watching, not for etiquette breaches that would make headlines, but for slips that could be whispered later as proof of your unworthiness. The rice is warm, the miso a little salty, the pickled plum sharp enough to wake you more effectively than coffee. Yet eating here is never about the taste. It's about control. A modern office worker might stress over spilling soup at a business lunch. Imagine multiplying that tension by 10, because your future depends on it. Each mouthful becomes a negotiation with fate, each swallow a silent pledge to your role. Conversation, when it appears, is brittle and carefully arranged. A higher-ranked concubine comments on the weather. Another laughs too politely at a servant's slip. You smile at the right moments, though inside you may be tallying alliances and measuring tones. Words here weigh more than food, and a poorly timed giggle could cost more than a missed meal. The meal concludes with a ritual wiping of the lips, a bow, and the silent stacking of trays. You stand when you're supposed to stand, move when you're supposed to move, a puppet stringed to invisible rules. As the trays are whisked away, you can't help but glance at the others around you, wondering which one might be plotting a path higher, and which one might already be marked for quiet dismissal. After the meal, the transition is seamless. Attendants adjust your silks, smooth your sleeves, and prepare you for the lessons of refinement that define the rest of the morning. It's a reminder that in this house, life isn't divided into neat compartments of bathing, praying, eating. Instead, it's one continuous performance, each act bleeding into the next. You catch a glimpse of your reflection in a lacquered screen. Powdered face, elaborate hair, silks glowing faintly in the morning light. Is that really you, or just the mask you've learned to wear? The question lingers as you move toward the next chamber, where shamisen strings and ink brushes wait like examiners ready to judge. The shamisen rests across your lap like a waiting animal, 3 strings taut and expectant, its wooden body polished to a gloss that reflects the lantern light. You hold the plectrum in your hand, the bachi, heavy as a command, and strum the first note. The sound reverberates low and twangy, filling the chamber with something that feels both haunting and precise. This isn't a concert, it's survival. You are tested not just on your ability to play, but on how gracefully you sit, how your sleeve falls when you lift your arm, how your fingers glide without betraying effort. Ever felt nervous giving a presentation at work, aware that your boss is measuring every twitch? Imagine that, but with music as your report card and silence as your punishment. The lesson doesn't stop with the shamisen. A brush and inkstone are set before you, the water still rippling where it was poured. You dip the brush, lift it steady, and trace strokes across paper kanji characters and delicate waka poetry. Each line must be elegant, balanced, never hurried. Calligraphy is not just writing, it is reputation in ink. The wrong curve of a stroke can look sloppy, careless, And that small carelessness can be whispered into a story of incompetence. The teacher hovers, correcting a line here, praising a flourish there, while you fight to keep your wrist fluid. Poetry follows naturally. You recite a waka 31 syllables, arranged like a puzzle, your voice soft and steady. The words are centuries old, yet they feel as fragile as glass in your mouth. You're reminded of the Heian court, where women like Murasaki Shikibu, author of The Tale of Genji, made poetry their weapon and shield. A misplaced word could wound as much as a dagger, while a perfect verse could enchant an entire room. Do you ever think about how Twitter squeezes thoughts into 280 characters? Poetry here is the same kind of compression, but with stakes much higher than likes or retweets. By late morning, the lessons blur together. Shamisen practiced calligraphy, drills, poetry, recitations, all woven into the same demand: be perfect, be graceful, be indispensable without ever looking like you're trying. There's humor in the absurdity. You are expected to embody natural talent, yet drilled like a soldier. You might laugh if it weren't so exhausting. Still, these lessons offer one unexpected gift: a shield of focus. While your hand repeats brushstrokes, your mind can wander, drifting into thoughts you wouldn't dare say aloud. You wonder if the Lord will notice your playing, or if the calligraphy will ever be displayed beyond this room. You wonder if your rivals are secretly fumbling the same exercises and hiding their mistakes with the same rehearsed smiles. Have you ever sat through a training session at work, feigning interest while planning dinner in your head? That's you, except instead of dinner, you're planning survival strategies. Your teacher pauses to correct your grip, his fingers brushing yours, and you remember once more how little of your life belongs to you. Even the angle of your wrist is a matter of inspection. Yet you also remember the stories of women who turned these skills into weapons. A witty poem whispered at the right moment, a melody played at the right gathering could make the difference between being forgotten and being favored. Refinement is not just decoration, it is influence. The lessons end with a bow your forehead nearly to the tatami mat, and the tools are taken away. Your body aches slightly from sitting seiza for so long, legs folded beneath you like furniture. The silence that follows feels heavy, as if the walls themselves are waiting to see whether you absorbed enough grace to merit existing another day. You rise, carefully, straightening silks, adjusting hairpins, and stepping back into the corridor. The sunlight has shifted, slanting through paper screens, and the quiet of the house presses down again. You've performed music, poetry, calligraphy, all the things meant to turn you into a living ornament. Now comes the hardest test of all waiting. Hook first, because the truth is sharp. The hardest part of being a concubine isn't the silks, or the lessons, or even the politics, it's the waiting. Waiting is its own battlefield, and you are armed only with patience sharpened into something almost deadly. You step into the corridor, long and dim, the paper doors casting shadows shaped like cages. Outside, the garden stretches wide gravel paths, raked into perfect waves that will never be walked without permission. Inside, you sit, where you're told decorative as a painted screen, waiting for something you cannot name. The waiting begins in the gardens, where you stroll with deliberate slowness. Pine trees arch like brushstrokes, koi twist through ponds, and yet you cannot escape the sense that all this beauty is a stage set for lives more powerful than yours. You linger, careful not to look like you're lingering, because a concubine who waits too eagerly is as dangerous as one who appears indifferent. Have you ever sat in a doctor's waiting room, flipping through magazines, just to look occupied, though all you want is the door to open. That's you here, except instead of a checkup, the verdict could be your future. Sometimes the waiting takes the form of embroidery. You sit cross-legged pulling a needle through silk tracing cranes or plum blossoms while your mind stitches through possibilities. Each stitch is delicate, each thread symbolic, but the true embroidery is happening in your head, imagining whether the Lord will summon you, whether rivals are whispering in another chamber, whether your silence speaks louder than your words ever could. Servants pass by, occasionally their trays clinking faintly, and you study their faces for clues. Did they glance at you a moment too long? Did their silence mean news is brewing? You're trained to read everything as a signal, because in a world where you control almost nothing, decoding shadows is one of the few powers you hold. The garden walls offer no answers. You wander them anyway, breathing in the faint sweetness of cherry blossoms. They bloom briefly, then fall, and the symbolism isn't lost on you. Concubines like blossoms are admired for a season and then swept aside. You think of real women in history whose lives echoed this fragility, concubines who shone for a moment before vanishing into obscurity, and others, like Lady Kasuga, who transformed waiting into strategy, turning stillness into political leverage. Do you ever wonder how much of history was written in pauses in these stretches of enforced quiet? The sun climbs, shadows shift, and still you wait. You glance at the sky, at the slow drift of clouds, and remind yourself not to fidget. Fidgeting suggests nerves. Nerves suggest weakness, and weakness is remembered. Even silence here is performance. That's the cruel joke. You're not just waiting, you're performing waiting. Like an actor paused mid-scene, you must hold your body in perfect stillness, as though eternity were a role you had auditioned for. Sometimes, another concubine crosses your path, her silks whispering against tatami mats. There's no open conversation, only a bow, a flicker of eyes, and a silence thick with calculation. Did she linger in her bow too long, signaling deference? Or was it a test rivalries are written in these subtleties, where one misplaced glance can change alliances? Think of modern workplace politics, who sits nearest the boss, who gets CC'd on the important email. That's the scale of power here, multiplied 100-fold. The worst part is the uncertainty. Will you be called? Will you be ignored? Every hour that passes feels like both a reprieve and a sentence. You tell yourself the stillness is safety, that not being noticed today is protection. But part of you aches for the summons, for something to break the monotony. Waiting is heavy. It presses into your bones until you feel more furniture than person. The koi ripple the pond again, scattering sunlight across the water. You trace the ripples with your eyes, wondering how long it takes for the circles to vanish, for the surface to look undisturbed. Maybe waiting is like that. No matter how restless you feel inside the surface, must remain calm, smooth, unbroken. Your hands rest on your lap, your sleeves draped like folded wings. You look toward the inner rooms, still silent, still distant, and you remind yourself that silence can be as loud as a scream if you hold it long enough. The silence finally breaks, though not with a summons for you. It breaks with whispers, that restless current running through the corridors faster than any servant's feet. You hear it first as a murmur outside the sliding screens, then a faint rustle of sleeves as women drift together like moths to a lamp. Court gossip, they call it, though it deserves a sharper name. This is the bloodstream of the household, and you are both its pulse and its prey. You lean against a wooden pillar, pretending interest in the garden, while your ears work harder than your eyes. The talk is never straightforward. It comes wrapped in careful tones like gifts meant to look generous, but hiding barbs inside. Someone mentions that a favored concubine was seen sitting too close at dinner. Another hints that a letter went missing, maybe stolen, maybe misplaced. A laugh floats into the air, too sharp to be casual, and you know that laugh will be repeated later, twisted into another kind of evidence. It's remarkable how quickly rumors travel here. Servants carrying trays of tea often carry more than porcelain. They carry stories, and stories way heavier than rice sacks. You imagine them like couriers of secrets delivering whispers from one corner of the palace to another faster than any official decree. Think about modern office break rooms, a single raised eyebrow over someone's new promotion, and suddenly the whole building knows before the ink dries on the contract. Same principle, just with more silk and less coffee. The gossip isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's hopeful, even desperate. A woman murmurs about a relative's advancement, another confides fears of being sent away. Yet even kindness can be dangerous. A sympathetic glance today might be used as proof of conspiracy tomorrow. You listen, contribute little, and let your silence be your strongest ally. Have you ever bitten your tongue in a group chat knowing one careless emoji could backfire? That's you now. Except with your livelihood at stake. You remember hearing about Oichi, the sister of Oda Nobunaga, who was married off as part of a political alliance. Her beauty and grace became tools of negotiation, her fate determined by whispers in corridors like these. If women of such rank could be undone by the politics of rumor, how much more vulnerable are you whose value is measured by favor alone? The conversation swells and ebbs like tidewater. One concubine mentions a physician's visit, and suddenly everyone is speculating on health airs and hidden intentions. Another whispers about a rival's misstep during poetry recitation, a mistake magnified into scandal by the sheer hunger for talk. You sit still, breathing evenly, though inside your thoughts twist like koi in a pond. Every whisper could be about you. Every silence could hide your name. Gossip here is not just entertainment, it is currency. To know something before others is to hold a weapon. To be the subject of a rumor is to bleed without a wound. You wonder who first decided that silence is safer than speaking, and you realize it wasn't a decision at all. It's survival instinct, as ancient as the palace walls. Still part of you can't help but feel the absurdity. These women trapped in gilded rooms invent dramas out of thin air because real battles are fought beyond their reach. So they sharpen words instead of swords, trade glances instead of blows. And you play along because not playing would be noticed, and being noticed in the wrong way is the first step toward erasure. The whispers thin out as footsteps retreat down the corridor, sleeves trailing like fading echoes. You're left in the hush again, though the air feels charged, as if the walls themselves are holding on to the secrets they've absorbed. You smooth your robe, adjust your hairpin, and remind yourself what you just overheard is not background noise. It's the architecture of survival. The summons arrives without warning, as they always do. A servant bows low voice soft, announcing that the Lord requests your presence. Your heart quickens, though your face does not change. You rise smoothing silks that suddenly feel too heavy, and follow the servant through corridors that seem longer than they did just minutes ago. Each step is rehearsed, heels, aligned sleeves, trailing perfectly, but inside every muscle is buzzing. It's strange, isn't it? How anticipation can make even polished wooden floors feel like quicksand. The room you enter is bathed in half-light lanterns, glowing just enough to outline the shape of authority seated beyond. You bow deeply forehead, grazing the tatami mat, and wait. The silence stretches intentional and heavy. When the Lord finally speaks, it is not the words themselves, but the tone that matters, curious, commanding, occasionally amused. You answer in soft phrases carefully balanced between wit and humility. A single clever remark can charm but push too far, and it looks like arrogance. Have you ever walked into a job interview where you knew the smile mattered more than the resume? That's this moment, except your resume is your entire existence. He gestures for music, and a shamisen is brought forward. You play fingers steady, despite the tremor hiding in your bones. The notes weave into the room, filling it with something fragile, almost prayer-like. The Lord's gaze rests on you, measuring not just the sound, but the stillness of your posture, the grace of your fingers, the way your eyes lower at precisely the right moments. Performance here is not about talent alone. It is about embodying loyalty through art. Sometimes he asks questions, light ones about poetry, subtle ones about family, dangerous ones about loyalties. You answer with care, weaving truth and caution together. A wrong answer could be remembered, filed away like an account book of offenses. You think of Lady Yodo, who once held immense sway at court. Her power began in conversations like these, where charm turned into influence. Can you imagine how many futures have been carved not by battles on fields, but by murmured words behind folding screens? The Lord laughs at something you say, and the room shifts lighter for a moment. You allow yourself a small smile, just enough to seem human, not enough to seem bold. Every gesture is calculation dressed as spontaneity. You know the other women will ask later what expression he wore, what question he asked, and the answers will ripple through the household faster than fire through paper. Tea is served the clink of porcelain punctuating the conversation. You pour carefully, hand-steady sleeves, tucked just so the liquid flowing like an unbroken ribbon. Even serving tea becomes an audition. The aroma of roasted leaves drifts upward, grounding you briefly. Have you ever focused on one tiny detail, like the hum of an air conditioner, just to survive the tension of a big moment? That's your tea anchoring you in the weight of expectation. The conversation winds down, and with it, your performance. You bow again, forehead to floor, and wait for dismissal. When it comes, relief mixes with a hollow kind of ache. You've survived this round, but survival is not the same as victory. You leave the chamber with the same careful steps, every movement echoing back into silence. The corridor outside feels brighter than when you entered, though you know it's only your own heartbeat making the air shimmer. You walk away, sleeves trailing, and though no one says it, you can feel eyes waiting to measure how long you were inside, what expression you wear now, and what that might mean for everyone else. Hook first, because here's the bitter irony. The moment you step back from the Lord's chamber, you don't step into triumph, you step into confinement. The true weight of life here isn't in the dazzling summons. It's in the hours afterward, when the palace remembers you are more ornament than person. Afternoon seclusion presses down like a second skin. And if the morning felt rehearsed, this feels like being locked inside your own reflection. You return to your chamber, the doors sliding shut with a softness that somehow sounds like finality. The air is heavy with incense that no longer comforts. You pick up a length of embroidery, the needle glinting in the muted light, and begin the slow dance of thread through silk. Cranes take shape beneath your hands, but your mind drifts elsewhere, replaying every word, every glance from the Lord's room. Did you bow deeply enough? Was your smile the right size? The embroidery distracts your hands, but the ache of repetition gnaws at you, as if the same plum blossom, stitched 100 times, might erase the memory of one wrong move. Sometimes you write instead. The ink stains your fingers, and waka poetry flows onto paper, though the words feel more like confessions disguised as art. You imagine some historian, centuries from now, discovering these scraps and reading them as polished expressions of elegance. If only they knew they were born from restlessness, from the tight coil of a life lived in a cage of gold. Do you ever doodle absent-mindedly in a meeting, not because you're inspired, but because you need the minutes to move faster? That's you here, except the stakes are higher and the ink far less forgiving. The chamber is quiet, too quiet, until your own thoughts grow louder than any shamisen string. You remember stories of women who endured this same isolation, some bending gracefully, like bamboo in the wind, others snapping under pressure. Lady Shokoin, for example, is whispered about as someone who lost her mind from the sheer silence of palace life, her brilliance eroded by years of waiting rooms and closed doors. The thought chills you. How thin is the line between composure and collapse? Servants come and go, ghost-like, bringing tea or adjusting cushions. You watch them without speaking, envying their movement, their ability to leave this room without consequence. Even their chatter in the hall feels like a rebellion compared to your enforced stillness. The irony doesn't escape you. They serve under orders. But somehow, you are the one more trapped. To pass the time, you practice gestures in the polished surface of a lacquered tray. How to tilt your head, how to lower your eyes, how to smile without showing hunger. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But every gesture, rehearsed here, could be the one that secures your place tomorrow. Like an athlete practicing the same move 1,000 times, you train your body into a perfect script, though the stage is nothing more than an afternoon's empty chamber. The seclusion grows heavier as shadows lengthen. Your mind wanders to the garden, outside to the sound of laughter you heard earlier from another wing, and you wonder whether the women laughing there are mocking you, or if their laughter is simply the same mask you wear. The ache of not knowing presses harder than the ache of repetition. You pause in your stitching needle, caught mid-air, and glance toward the window where the light has turned golden. The world outside is moving. Merchants in the town are shouting prices. Farmers are counting coins. Children are chasing one another through alleys. And here you sit, suspended in a tableau. Your existence narrowed to silk ink and silence. It would almost be funny if it weren't so suffocating. The needle pierces fabric again, the thread trailing like time itself, steady, endless, and impossible to rewind. Lanterns glow as twilight drapes itself across the compound, their orange halos flickering against wooden beams and paper walls. The hush of afternoon seclusion gives way to the practiced bustle of attendants, lighting wicks and sliding trays into place. Evening is meant to be a softer hour, but here, softness is just another layer of performance. You rise, adjust your sleeves, and step into a hall that smells faintly of grilled fish and incense, ready to be an entertainer rather than an ornament. The shamisen makes its return strings tuned to perfection, the bachi resting in your palm. You play with the same precision as before, except now your music must shimmer, not just exist. Lantern light catches the lacquer, and the notes thread into the evening air, filling the chamber with something poised between elegance and boredom. That's the trick you must make the tedious look entrancing. Like an office worker smiling through the 15th PowerPoint slide, you smile through melodies every ear has already heard 100 times. Dancers glide into the room, their movements slow and deliberate fans snapping open like whispers of wind. You watch then join when it is your turn, sleeves trailing like waves. Every bow of your body, every tilt of your hand is observed not just by the Lord, but by rivals measuring whether you stumble. Even laughter in this room is calculated too loud, and it feels desperate too soft, and it feels insincere. You've never thought so much about the volume of joy before, but here, even joy must be rehearsed. The food arrives small dishes of rice, simmered vegetables, grilled eel gleaming with sauce. You serve pouring sake into porcelain cups, careful not to spill even a drop. The fragrance of rice wine rises warm and sweet, and you sense how even the act of pouring has weight. A concubine who pours clumsily may as well sign her dismissal papers. Have you ever balanced a tray at a party terrified of spilling red wine on someone's white carpet? Multiply that by the knowledge that your entire standing depends on it, and you have this moment. Voices rise, light conversation, drifting over the food. Someone recites poetry, another laughs at a remembered story, and all the while you are part of the scenery, nodding at the right pauses, smiling at the right punchlines. This is not your time to shine. It is your time to be seamless, like silk, stitched into a robe noticeable only if it tears. And yet beneath the surface, you can't help noticing the strain. Some concubines push their wit too far. Others hide behind feigned modesty, and you see the small cracks where ambition shows itself. It's oddly comforting. Even in this perfect stage play, the human flaws leak out like candle wax. You remind yourself that history remembers not just the polished, but the vulnerable. Lady Yodo and Lady Kasuga may have been legends, but they too must have endured evenings like this smiling, while thinking of strategies that had nothing to do with grilled eel or music. As the night deepens, the lanterns flicker more boldly, and the performances grow slower, more languid. The Lord leans back, half amused, half weary, while attendants refill his cup and clear the trays. You sense the mood shifting not toward intimacy, but toward indifference. To be overlooked now can feel like safety. Indifference means survival, while attention can be a double-edged sword. The evening winds down laughter, fading into yawns, and the music slips into softer chords. You bow step back and let yourself dissolve into the shadows of the room. The performance has ended, though you know tomorrow it will repeat with slight variations like a song played endlessly on loop. The corridor greets you with cooler air, the sound of insects outside, reminding you there is still a world beyond these walls. But your role is clear. Even in the glow of lanterns, you are light meant to illuminate someone else's evening, never your own. The lanterns may dim, but the true game of the palace never sleeps. Night is when politics tighten their grip, curling behind folding screens where shadows loom larger than people. You step into a side chamber where murmurs float like smoke, soft and dangerous. It isn't music or embroidery. Now, it's alliances being whispered, rivalries rehearsed, small favors traded like coins. Night politics have no stage directions, and yet you feel as though you're acting all the same. The women gather in subtle clusters, sleeves brushing eyes glancing sideways. Words are light, almost meaningless on the surface. Questions about health, compliments about embroidery. But the undercurrent is unmistakable. One woman mentions the Lord's laugh at dinner. Another counters with a detail about how long he lingered over a song. To an outsider, it would sound like idle chatter, but to you, it's code. Every detail is weighed, and every silence is read, like ink drying on paper. Ever been in a group text where half the meaning comes not from what's written, but from what's left unsaid? That's this magnified 100 times, and the consequences are carved into futures, not phone screens. Sometimes servants linger too long at the edge of the room, listening with faces blank as stone. You wonder which conversations they will carry elsewhere, which names will appear in the next round of whispers. A careless phrase tonight can become a weapon tomorrow. You remember Lady Kasuga, again the Tokugawa power broker, who turned even gossip into political leverage. She understood what most forget, that in places like this, stories are sharper than swords. You find yourself contributing sparingly, a smile here, a polite nod, there the occasional remark so carefully crafted it could double as embroidery. You've learned that survival lies in saying just enough to appear engaged, never enough to be cornered. Have you ever attended a party where everyone is pretending to enjoy themselves, but each laugh feels rehearsed? Imagine that except the stakes are exile, not social awkwardness. The tension grows heavier as the night deepens. Some women attempt boldness, hinting at secrets they don't fully own, dangling them like fishing hooks. Others retreat into silence, hoping invisibility might shield them. You balance between the two, letting your silence speak louder than words, a tactic that has saved many before you. Still, you feel the weight of eyes measuring, you calculating whether your restraint hides ignorance or cunning. Tea is served again, though this time it tastes less like comfort and more like surveillance. Cups clink softly, and with each sip, you wonder if the woman across from you is memorizing the angle of your hand, the flicker of your smile. Even thirst must be managed here. The Lord rarely appears during these night politics. His absence is the very reason the room stirs so much. Without him, the hierarchy loosens and everyone reaches a little further than they should. It's dangerous and exhilarating, a kind of freedom bound in silk cords. You sense that tomorrow, some of these alliances will evaporate with the morning mist, but tonight, they matter fiercely. You withdraw at the right moment, bowing low, excusing yourself with a smile that says everything and nothing. The corridor feels cooler, the hush of crickets more honest than anything spoken inside. You walk back towards your chamber, mind heavy with the weight of what was said and unsaid. Night in the palace is not about rest. It is about remembering that your place is as fragile as the paper doors that separate one chamber from another. Your hand lingers briefly on the doorframe before you slide it open, aware that even in sleep politics will hover. You bow once more to the silence and step into the room where only the moon keeps secrets. Hook first, because here is the cruelest truth of all: the day doesn't end. When the lanterns are snuffed, it lingers in the dark inside your head, refusing to let you rest. You lie awake on your futon, silks folded beside you, hairpins set neatly in a lacquered box, and yet your mind is louder than the night insects. The crickets sing outside the paper screens, their rhythm steady, but inside you the rhythm is restless, a drumbeat of what-ifs and maybes. The moonlight slides across the tatami pale and cold, and you watch it as though it might offer answers. Shadows stretch long, making the room look larger than it is, though you know its boundaries by heart. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the quiet, and wonder if somewhere else in the compound another concubine lies awake, replaying the same day in her head. Did she smile too much? Did she say too little? Did the Lord notice her? Or worse, did he not notice at all? Your mind drifts back to the garden pond you passed this morning, to the koi, gliding in circles. You feel like one of them now, moving endlessly around a confined space, admired perhaps, but never free. The comparison isn't tragic so much as ironic. You're pampered, dressed in silks, perfumed and polished, yet as powerless as a fish in water someone else owns. Do you ever lie awake replaying your day, obsessing over details no one else remembers? That's you here. Accept the details, decide whether tomorrow you rise higher or vanish entirely. Sometimes the moonlight tricks you. You think you see movement, a ripple across the screen, a figure in the corner, but it's only your mind weaving shapes from shadows. Still, it reminds you that in this palace, nothing is ever fully private. Even in sleep, you feel observed. The walls are too thin, the silence is too heavy, the politics too close. Sleep, when it comes, is rarely restful. You turn slightly on the futon eyes, tracing the ceiling beams. History tells of women who survived decades like this, adapting until the waiting, the performing, the silences all blurred into a rhythm they could endure. Lady Yodo, Lady Kasuga, names remembered, because they outlasted rivals, because they learned not just to endure nights like this, but to use them. You wonder if they too stared at the ceiling, wondering if their legacy would be worth the ache of each sleepless hour. The moon climbs higher, silvering the edges of your sleeves, and you let your breath slow, even if your thoughts do not. Tomorrow could bring anything, a summons, a dismissal, or the same loop of embroidery and whispers. That's the unspoken rule here. You live not by certainty, but by constant readiness. Every dawn resets the performance, every dusk closes the curtain, and every night you lie awake, wondering if you'll be written into history or erased like ink washed from paper. The crickets outside grow softer, or maybe you've grown used to them. The silence feels heavier now, pressing into your chest like another layer of brocade. You close your eyes, not because sleep has claimed you, but because you know morning will come, whether you rest or not. The day has ended, but the waiting never does. And now, chosen listener, let the palace walls fade into silence. The lanterns dim until only the soft glow of memory remains. You've walked the corridors, heard the whispers, and felt the weight of a day that never truly ended. But here, in this quiet moment, you don't need to perform or wait. You can rest and imagine